there was a part of the walk that was in New Hampshire, and a very close friend of mine was moved up there by the organization, and he was in there for a number of years, and I had met a Bill Career up there, and it's my understanding that he came here with a group of people that had been involved with Church of the Living Word. Well, one of my closest friends was part of that, and I tried to go to his wedding, and I was barred. They didn't let me in. So I was with a friend of mine's father, and he said, well, if Dave is not allowed in, I'm not coming in. They relented. They let me in. But I'll never forget, just before this wedding took place, I get a call. And I go up the stairs in this church, and I'm suddenly surrounded by a bunch of people who start laying hands on me and prophesying and giving directive words. And those of you who have had experience with the movie may know and understand some of what that is. And it really was a part of my personal journey that got me exposed to the world of the cults. When I was in my group, I didn't know it was a cult. In fact, the Spiritual Counterfeits Project was the first organization that printed any literature on the group at all in 1977. And I left my group in 1974, so there just wasn't material out there in those days in terms of some of these new groups. Now in my presentation, the second one, not this one so much, but the second one, when we deal with the recovery from spiritual abuse and the kinds of abuse that you go through with these type of groups, it gives insight in how to deal with that. As far as my PowerPoint go, I'm going to start using that. I was at a conference in Winona Lake, Indiana. That's when I was introduced to the Church of the Living Word. And from that, I got involved with a 2-year involvement. After I had left the group, I had a friend who was a journalism student at Temple University, and he asked me to go in undercover. And back in my 20s, the guy there with the black stripe over my ass, that was sort of to conceal who I was. Because I was undercover at the time when I was doing this story for him. So I really got to see it close up, and Alan Tate Wood, he can really give you a direct personal experience about this particular organization, Unification Church. What was interesting about that was I ended up going to Washington, D.C. in 1976, and Senator Dole back in those days had a gathering there. And I was there the first night, and I met George Swope, who had been a Baptist minister and was one of the founders of the American Family Foundation. So part of my story here is I was at the ground level of parents groups that were just organizing back in those days, and former members that were organizing, and I became involved with a group called Focus and Refocus, former Cultist Support Network. So we saw that there was a real problem with people that were coming out of groups of this type and the recovery issues that they were facing, overcoming their cult experience and understanding it. So the processes that are at work is a big deal, as well as content, but there's a relationship between the two, and I'll try to make distinctions about that. What I'd like to start with is there are various types of cults. And so you'll see a variety of them within the last, for me, 40 years, So you see Jim Jones up there. The one on the left is the Way International. These were groups that were, seen as more or less new cults. David Koresh at the bottom, Waco. Then you have Eastern mystical groups. The more notable one that you would see at the airport an awful lot was the Hare Krishnas. And they were developing ways to deal with them in terms of how they were soliciting the public for funds, how they were recruiting. In fact, it got so bad at the airports, it went to the United States Supreme Court, and cults had to be in booths. And you'll notice that you don't see the booths anymore. They can't do what they used to do. I remember people would miss their flights. There would be sleight of hand with change that they got back. It wasn't accurate, the money they got in return. It was also known as the doctrine of transcendental trickery. Moon just died, but this was one of his mass weddings. Notice that it's under the category of eclectic and syncretistic, a blending of traditions, for example, from the West, and for example, with the Moon Organization, Christianity, and parts of, the Korean folk religions and Buddhism, and just a mix of things. And here's other groups that had that mixture of East and West. Church Universal and Triumphant, and Sai Baba. Well, again, these leaders have died not too long ago. A lot of people aren't as familiar with some of these groups, the politico, neo-Nazi, and paramilitary type. There's really concerns about that with Timothy McVeigh, when you remember the Oklahoma bombing, after he had been to Waco Memorial events in Texas. And so, one of the, used to be a perennial candidate for the presidency was Lyndon LaRouche. And so you have certain groups that have a political side to it. If you're in Washington, D.C. and you see Obama with Hitler's mustache, usually that's associated with the LaRouche group. Then you have New Age, UFO type groups. You're hearing much more about this these days. If you watch the History Channel and you see ancient aliens, or, there's a lot of people that are really getting caught up in this, but back in the 90s, you had Amshinrikya, where they had that sarin gas attack in the subway system. Again, how is it that people are behaving like this? And then the one in the middle with the UFO, Rael, or the Raelians. Did anyone remember hearing about the clone baby? I don't think we've ever seen the clone baby, even though they had their PhD defend this. Heaven's Gate was another one. In fact, back in the 70s, they were known as Bo and Pete. And I remember when the news was breaking, and I was talking to Yanni about this, we talked on the phone, and we were trying to figure out, who are these people? It ended up being the same founders, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, his wife. And then they changed their name to D and Doe and Guinea and Pig. So you get some very interesting dimensions to these. Then you have the satanic occult organizations, that have a totally different appeal to them. And that's the thing I would say about the types of cults, that the appeals are different in those groups. Now, the thing that was really striking to me as the years went on was the commonality I saw in the group dynamic aspects of it, the methodologies and the characteristics in terms of how they function in the totalistic or high demand group relationship. And then you have sales or multi-marketing pyramid type companies. There's controversy with Amway through the decades. In fact, the book in the middle there, it says Amway, the Cult of Free Enterprise with Steve Butterfield. You have, especially the people that are distributors in the organization, when they come out and tell their story, a number of them write books, and there's lots of stuff on the internet about this if you do research on it. So now I want to move past the types of group. Now, the reason for the types is just to give you an idea of the different appeals from different types of groups, but they end up having this cultic, controversial dynamic about them. Now, when you're dealing with, I would say, the latter rain movement, preceding the latter rain movement, you would have the Joseph Smith, who's the founder of the Mormon Church. So in the 1830s, it was a real significant time in American history when you're talking about new religious groups, restoration groups. They're trying to bring back the fundamentals of Christianity. They've discovered the true church, and they point to this apostasy that's taken place since the early church, and we need to get back to the true gospel, to the true church, and that's a huge appeal. But there's an element of revelation that comes into this, and the Book of Mormon is a big one for the Mormons. And notice how fat that Bible is that's on the left. It has the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl and Great Price. Now that's part of the teaching structure of Mormonism. So just be aware that that revelation is larger than just the Book of Mormon. And a lot of their ads is like the middle one. You'll see the Bible and the Book of Mormon. If you've ever traveled and you stay in a Mormon hotel, one of the ways that you will know that it's owned by Mormons is you not only have the Gideon Bible in your room, you also have the Book of Mormon in your room. And they do that where they have hotels. Another thing that is very important about the basics of this is that what the insider sees is not what the outsider sees. Now I'm showing you a graphic overview of the Mormon worldview. And notice they have 3 states after the afterlife: the celestial kingdom, the terrestrial kingdom, and the telestial kingdom. And they show the Broadway, and some of it you would recognize from the Bible. But what's interesting about the freeway that gets you to the highest heaven is the fundamentals of the Restoration movement: faith, repentance, baptism, and the Holy Ghost. So they only went so far with this because of the nature of the Restoration movement and its beginnings with the Campbell brothers and others that were with them. Now we move into a more modern time period. After World War II, you have the Latter Rain movement. And William Branham, I liken him to George Washington of the United States. You know, he's like a founding father of who we are as a nation. So if you really look at the history, now when I was in the walk, I didn't know about Branham's history. I didn't know about, the angel that stood beside him and spoke to him, and all kinds of things about that background I didn't know. But I did come to find out later. Though it is called the New Apostolic Reformation, the movement's teachings are not new, but they're very old. Throughout church history, groups on the fringes of Christianity have attempted to restore the office of apostles and prophets, including the Montanists of the 2nd century and the Irvingites in the 1800s. Now, one of the reasons I'm bringing this out is that after I left my group and I went to a place that was dreaded, it was called seminary. Now, the nickname was cemetery while I was a member, so you just went the other direction. And the reason why this was such a big deal to me on a personal level is I had gone through what I consider a form of indoctrination. There were certain things that were selected, but there was a model to the way it was selected, how it was presented, and it had a very convincing, closed-minded impact on me. So when I started to learn about the roots of this movement and what was in it, I began to see a lot of where the material I was believing was coming from. So when you look at the what's called the New Order of the Latter Rain, there's really a historic heritage here that most people who are in that movement I've spoken to in 40 years that I've been exposed to this, really don't have all those details. And what's important is when those critical details are missing, you don't understand where the thinking has come from. One of the things that was very crucial to the basics of what I was learning is that it was a revelation. The impression that I got, it was a current revelation. And I remember when I was in the group, one of the things that I remember hearing is, it's got to be a revelation to you, Dave. The letter killeth, but the Spirit gives life. So it was the nature of how they dealt with Bible texts. And one of the things that happened to me in the 70s, that I was thoroughly convinced that wine in the Bible was not wine, but it was grape juice. And I had gone through an hour and a half where I was totally convinced of it. So I was talking to some friends, and 2 of them had become these dreaded seminary students. So they sat me down and they showed me in the Greek and the Hebrew. Oinos in the Greek is a fermented fruit. That's not grape juice. That is wine. That's what wine is made of. When I began to see that the words that I was believing had not been fully qualified and defined completely, that really affected how I looked at a lot of different things. So I had to really get into the history of the Latter Rain movement and why it was such a significant thing. In fact, it started in Canada, which is right next to you up here in Alaska. Well, it's not too far from where I am in Pennsylvania if you go north. But what's interesting there is William Branham and what happened after World War II. And there was this real missionary focus with some church groups. So when the Founding Fathers started to develop the Latter Rain, it became a worldwide influence. It became very influential, and big part of that had to do with the healing ministry of Branham and the way he would heal people. Oral Roberts came later. So in 1949, the General Council of the Assemblies of God in Seattle overwhelmingly approved a resolution that was prepared by the committee that dealt with the Latter Rain movement. In other words, this was a special study that they did. And they adopted a resolution that disapproved of the following practices of the Latter Rain, and an action was made necessary as a result of the movement invading the Assemblies of God. That movement, to this day, has certain Assemblies of God divided till this time. Now, the things that they pointed out were there was an overemphasis on impartation, identifying and bestowing confirming gifts by the laying on of hands. So what's really important about that is the authority issue. And I know to this day, if people want to lay hands on me, I'm very boundary sensitive about that. The erroneous teaching that the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. Now what's really important about this is when I came into the walk, I didn't have a background in apostles and prophets. Like, what are the qualifications of an apostle? I really couldn't tell you. But when I studied it out, when I was studying Greek and Hebrew, the Greek especially in the New Testament, I began to see that if you weren't an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you didn't qualify as an apostle. They had to be an eyewitness to his resurrection. So Acts chapter 1, verses 21 and 22 was a significant thing. Now the thing that tripped me up was John Robert Stevens, who was a founding apostle of the walk, claimed to have a visionary experience similar to Paul. But there's a catch to that one. When it came to Ananias, Paul had a vision. When it came to Jesus, he had an appearance, and the Greek word is different there. He was an eyewitness. He saw him. He saw him, and the seeing of it was so powerful that he was blinded for 3 days. Now, I heard Bart Ehrman in person, and I met Bruce Metzger, his teacher from Princeton, because I talked to Bruce Metzger about this when I met him, and I got into this pretty seriously with him. Concerning this issue, and the resurrection was critical to who an apostle was. Bart Ehrman's version that I heard in Kansas City at Midwest Baptist Theological Seminary, it's a psychological phenomenon. So this is the kind of thing that you will encounter, especially between the conservative wings of Christianity versus the liberal branches of Christianity. You're going to get this back and forth debating about all this. And on with the Assemblies of God's position on this. The extreme teaching advocated the new order by regarding confession of sin to man and deliverance as practice. Now, if anyone's familiar with the deliverance ministries of these groups, and I've seen many of them over the years, they really, I've seen people convulse on the floor, and you look at that and you wonder what in the world's going on. Now, as I've learned more about mind control, hypnosis is a very powerful influence when you're dealing with environments of this kind. And it's really important to know how to recognize it. And the intervention work that I've done in more than 30 years at this point, one of the basic questions I ask people when I talk to them is, would you recognize hypnosis in an environment if it was being used? I have not got an affirmative to that. Some people have a sketchy knowledge of it, but they don't really have a working knowledge of how it works in group environments, and that's really important when you're dealing with a topic like this. The extreme and unscriptural practice of imparting and imposing personal leadings in the name of gifts of utterance or gifts of the Spirit. One of the things that you get with this, and this was true in my experience and my friends and people that I've met ever since that time, is God telling that person directly whether you go to college or not, whether you're to stay home with your family, you're going to live in another location, or that sort of thing. And Ron Enroth wrote an article called The Power Abusers, and he consulted with Greek scholars concerning this, New Testament Greek scholars. And one of the things he brings out about that is they do not have personal jurisdiction over your private life. Now, in my second session, I'm going to go into more detail about the methods of what this is and the distinctions that are really serious and also are noteworthy. The Latter Rain featured individuals with oils in the hand and also songs singing in the Spirit. Some of you would probably recognize that God was doing a new thing. that the Manifest Son's teaching was placing experience over exposition. Now, those that are familiar with how people teach the Bible, for example, there's a certain method of approach that's being used when they teach it to you. Now, if you pull out the original Greek, you get into the history of where things were from and the context and all that, that's more known as expositional. I remember when I was in my group, I heard a lot of stories in the preaching. So there would, in fact, Stevens would emphasize how the word was a living impartation. So, that's something that's a distinctive about how this is being taught. So kingdom theology combined with the Manifest Sons of God doctrine. Now, what's very interesting with the Manifest Sons of God doctrine is why the Assemblies of God separated from it. It had excesses to it. So you had some of the early works. Franklin Hall was one of the early latter-rain writers. Atomic Power with God, with fasting and prayer. Notice that's the era when the atomic bomb was just invented. So you have Atomic Power with God. I'm just fascinated with the historical overlays. George Warnock's Feast of Tabernacles. John Robert Stevens had a teaching on this, and yet the overview of the latter rain is in his writings. So if you read Stevens' work and George Warnock, I see a lot of similarities with it. So you also had Oral Roberts. Now, when I was growing up as a kid, I saw Oral Roberts on television. He was on every weekend. You had Catherine Kuhlman, was another faith healer, who was a serious influence with Benny Hinn. What's very important about these personalities is the latter-rain roots and history from which they come. You see on the extreme right there's Oral with Elvis Presley. So when you're dealing with the South, you're dealing with the Pentecostals down there. So we're getting up into our time period, but earlier in history, because John Robert Stevens, because of the Manifest Sons of God teaching, he wasn't supposed to die. He had the powers of the resurrection. You get a very similar thing with Sam Fife and that plane crash, and he ended up dying and he didn't come back. There was another group that I'm aware of, the Alamo Foundation. When Susan Alamo died, who was a co-founder, they spent over a year praying for her to resurrect her. And if there's time, I'd love to show you the video where the mayor is being interviewed, and they're trying to get Alamo to respond because the body is decomposing. But they had prayer 24/7 trying to bring her back. And what's very important about this work, I just need to see a show of hands. Is anyone familiar with this book called Vengeance is Ours? Really important book in terms of the overview of the latter rain, and it specifically has material concerning the move and the walk. Both of these organizations are covered in that book. So what I'd like to do is just go into the since I have it up on the screen, I just want to go to what it's about here. Okay. Restored apostles and prophets, the move and the walk. The latter rain teachers seem to be oblivious that if there was to be a repeated apostolic Pentecost, then apostles and prophets must be restored as well. These teachers then devised historical scheme of restoration. Church history was understood as a succession of recoveries of lost and neglected truths. Now, I remember learning it like that. I mean, that's resonates with me. Luther recovered justification by faith, Baptist believers' baptism, Wesley holiness, A.B. Simpson healing, and the early Pentecostal pioneers of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. The recovery process was now further extended. The end-time body of Christ must go on to maturity and restore apostles and prophets. And these restored ministries must lead the church to a new and final dimension of power and authority. Well, that's big. We're talking huge worldview shifts that come out of this. Not only bringing in the final harvest, but establishing the kingdom of God upon earth. Notice what we're going through with Islam right now and the caliphate and what's going on in Iraq. Well, again, Islam has its versions. Two major sects or cultic groups, and I'm reading from the book put out by Al Dagger here. Two major sects or cultic groups of which the Manifest Sons of God title was applied was the Walk and the body of Christ, also known as the Move. The movement under the apostleship of John Robert Stephen, a disciple of William Branham. Sam Fife claimed to have direct revelations from God, including his version of the Manifest Sons of God teaching. And I don't know, is anyone familiar with Rick Joyner? Yeah, Rick Joyner is part of this movement. And he has Sam Fife's teaching on the Manifest Sons of God. When I read this, I could see the parallels between what I had been taught and what I see in this movement. And a lot of the key personalities that I'm covering in this presentation, Sam Fife makes mention in his position paper concerning Manifest Sons of God. So, and this lays the groundwork for the New Apostolic Reformation in some ways. Okay, so it shows you these thematic relationship, but also in some areas there is direct personal contact, and I'll touch on some of the ones that I'm aware of, because I know there's more than I'm even aware of that goes on. As the movement grew, Fife's followers left their homes and moved into the wilderness farms in various parts of the world. There were those who worked to attain a state of perfection. As a result, that Sam Fife would never die. That's what he believed. And then that plane crash happened. And he did die. And no resurrection. So that's a serious thing. In fact, when John Robert Stevens and my group died in 1983, the group I had belonged to, there was a big commotion in LA. There was so much noise going on that the LA police were called in. And guess what was happening? They were trying to bring him back from the dead. And that just wasn't happening. So, the Manifest Sons of God movement suffered a massive dissipation as a result of the many scandals. Interesting. Because when you look at the history of this movement as it's continued, there are many scandals. You read about it in the newspapers. You'll see them on the news, whether it's financial or young women are being abused, child abuse. It just goes on. All kinds of business controversies. And I remember when Enroth wrote his book, Lure of the Cults, he had portions of it with Martha Stevens, who had been the wife of John Robert. And she said his personal wealth was in the order of $40 million. He had control over that level of finances with the group. So, you know, it's there's a lot of history in this, and you would know some of it, probably more detail than I do on the local level. One of the things that he points out in this analysis of these two is fear and guilt. If you, and this is Al Dagger's statement. If you examine each group or movement that became affiliated with Dominion teaching and practice, we find strong elements of fear and guilt at the core of their structures. So it can really lock you in. I know the one thing that I was psychologically traumatized even was the fear of being a Judas. I mean, that loyalty thing was a big deal. If you doubt it or if you question, don't be a Judas. So, you know, it's a powerful thing. Extreme filling gear is instilled in those who do not move forward in their standard of perfection. So what you find with a lot of groups like this are rules. Strong rules about discipline. Strong rules about authority and being submissive and being obedient and not having an independent spirit. I mean, some group go this far, and I'm always curious which one go this far, as if they call you a Jezebel, you're really in trouble. That wicked woman. So, it's a serious deal. A strong sense of condemnation for using personal judgment breeds guilt in those who question the teachings and practices of the leaders. This results in fear of God's displeasure and troubling group sanctions. Compliance is a big issue with this, and it's how the compliance is achieved. Again, in my second session, I'm going to go into more of the dynamics of how that works. Positive confession and different use of language may apply depending on the group context. Fear is induced if one does not speak in a prescribed manner. My cancer is cured. In Lifton's term, that can literally be the language of non-thought. You know what that is? You don't think beyond that. You're cured? I don't doubt it. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. It's that kind of mindset. The problem is that the symptoms come back. How is it looked at? These are lying symptoms. These are from Satan. You know, the physical part of it really is not in the equation. It's not in the equation. It's very serious. I know people personally that are dead today because they did not get medical treatment that would have saved them from the death that they suffered. So, you know, when you get at this level of believing, especially in absolutes, and the group is teaching them in those absolute black and white kind of categories, that's a big deal. Critical thinking is a very serious matter when you're getting at these levels of obedience, submission to authority, and especially your thinking. You know, subordinating your will. And it's interpreted that God is not answering. I was with a woman whose son did die, and she went to see Kenneth Hagin. I was there with her when she talked to Hagin in person. It was at a Jesus Festival years ago, back in the 70s. And she was going to Kenneth Hagin, how can I bring back my son from the dead? She was trying to get his feedback concerning resurrecting him. He was buried at this point. Been dead for quite a while. But she believed that teaching. She believed in the absolutes that the latter rain had really taught her about faith. And you should see what happens when these things don't work. Is there sin in your life? Are you doubting? Do you lack faith? You know, it's that kind of thing. It puts the guilt on the person. Now, if you get into healing in the atonement teaching, some of the groups have this. Not all of them do, but some do. By his stripes you were healed. They take that as physical healing. Now, that's the problem when you don't know the Greek and the Hebrew and you don't know the nuances of language and the original historical context out of which they came. Now, most people that are in this are usually Bible-believing kind of persons. You know, they believe the Bible is true, but there's a qualification in the history of how did we get this, and where did it come from? The language and the geography, all of those things have a bearing on how you understand things. I can give you an example. It's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to go into heaven. Now, most people I ask this question to, what do you think the needle is? Now, if you differ with me, I like to see your hand raised. Do you think of a sewing needle that has that little hole in it? Yeah. Yeah, that's what most people take that as. Especially, you know, I started this in the 20th century. Now we're in the 21st century. But I asked people over the years, what do they think? There is the city gate. And there's, you know, from point A to point B, they had to protect themselves at night. So you're inside those walls and you're locked in until the sun comes up. But you would have merchant traveling from point A to point B. And he goes to get into the gate. And so they had, you ever have houses where they have the little doors for the cats and the dogs to go through? And only a little animal can get through those things. Well, they had something similar, but on a larger scale. It was a city gate, but then when the animals would come, they'd have to unload the barley and the wheat and everything so the camel or whatever that animal was could get through. That's the context of ancient cultural customs that 20th century and 21st century Americans like us, we're not familiar with all those kinds of things. So when you're reading the Bible, you've got to be very careful about the ancient context out of which in which it takes place. The only reason I bring all that up is healing in the atonement, if you take that on as an absolute, can cost you your life. And I know people that have died. I've watched Peter Popoff, who is an evangelist associated with that movement as well, where people would throw their diabetic medicine up on the stage. You see bottles just flying to the stage. Well, these people believe they're cured. And then the symptoms kick in. And one of the interesting ways you'll find out about what happens, local news stations go to these events. Not only just the local ones, the national ones do this. Guess what happens? They meet these people that have been healed, and have you been cured of cancer, and what about your heart, and all this. And I've been watching, again, for over 3 decades. Some people know how I collect videos. Well, I do collect these stories. But the reason I do it is the evidence of what happens to these people after they come out of one of those healing sessions. And the problem that you get is the symptoms may go away, but then they don't cure the disease. Especially if you have a cavity. Now, a lot of the ones that are popular are the lower back pains and the short leg gets lengthened. And I can go on with many examples of ones that are easy to convince people that something's happened, but the more difficult ones is another thing altogether. And then there's a screening mechanism that goes on. I went to a Benny Hinn convention in my area, Philadelphia. The place was packed out. The cars they filled up all those lots. They filled up the lots to such a degree that they blocked off Broad Street. Now, if you live in the Philadelphia area, they block off Broad Street. Something significant's going on. And Benny Hinn happened to be the big event. But the reason I bring that up is when I got in there, because it took me so long to get in there, I'm like, oh no, they're going to be putting me way up on the top floor, and there's going to be this little speck on the stage, and I won't get to see the close-up stuff. I walk around, and they guide me to the 7th row from the front. Now, what was neat about that, because it was the only empty seat, and they put me in there, I saw what was going on. And what I mean by that is there's a screening mechanism when they bring those people in the wheelchairs. They determine who they're going to bring and who they're not. A lot of the ones that are the more obviously difficult, they're not the ones that are coming up walking and jumping off the wheelchairs. And Peter Popoff was known as having wheelchairs set up for people who would kind of walk in like this. Oh, sit down and, we'll take care of it. We'll put that whole thing was set up so that when he actually had the broadcast recording, when people got up out of those wheelchairs, it appeared as though these people can't, now they're walking, now they're cured. These kinds of manipulations. And one of the things that Lifton points out in his book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, and he has 8 psychological themes, one of them is mystical manipulation. And anytime you're dealing with latter-rain history, you've really got to check into fact-check what's true and what's not true. So, and there's a lot of names associated with this Manifest Sons of God teaching. Earl Paulk was one. And I met with a group of former members of the move down there, but it was mainly his cathedral former members of it. That Tricia Weeks organized it. And so it was really something to hear their stories, And for me, it's a confirmation of why this works the way it does.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Jim Jones did that same thing.
Yes.
Is he somehow connected to this tradition, or just
he was an offshoot, Yanya, of the original Restoration movement of the 1830s.
Okay.
The Disciples of Christ and the Church of Christ were together at one time. They had to split. The Church of Christ exists to this day. Disciples of Christ, he became a Disciples of Christ minister. But what's interesting about Jim Jones is the Church of Christ was not a charismatic Pentecostal kind of group. They believed the first century gifts and all that were there at that time, but you don't have that today. Jim Jones picked up the charismatic side of things, and he did those healings. And yeah, right. But his background is an offshoot of the Restoration movement of the 1830s.
Okay,
now, what I find, because of my own experience and with the studies that I've done, is that you have a blending of things. Like the group that I was a part of, a group of them came up here and became a part of Sam Fife's group, So that's the kind of history you see with this. And especially, I kind of liken it like birds of a feather flock together. It kind of works like that. Yeah. Especially when they have certain things in common. That's one of the reasons I'm going through this history of the Manifest Sons, is to show you that there is a relationship there. And that it laid the foundation for the New Apostolic Reformation that we have to this day on a much larger scale. I mean, I don't think most people know the seriousness of how big this movement was growing, because they network with each other a lot. If you watch TBN, Trinity Broadcasting Network, they have a lot of those teachers on Trinity Broadcasting. And as you know, Trinity Broadcasting keeps multiplying different. They have the church channel, JC channel. There's a bunch of different channels that they now own and operate. So they're really in people's living rooms all over the world, and their mission was to really cause that to grow. In fact, I don't know if this is the time I could do this. No, I think I'll do the New Apostolic. I'm going to show you a. Yeah, this was, I mentioned this about the scan. That's the page. You see that on the right side? It says Scandals, Manifest Sons of God movement. Haven't gotten to the Shepherd movement yet. so I'll leave it at that. And when I say passing on the mantle, would anyone know what I'm talking about? What that is? Okay, I see shaking of head. So that's an important concept when you're dealing with authority and how it travels through history. Just think of George Washington and the legacy of leaders that followed him. Or even the popes, and they have succession to this day. So there's a real meaning to what they're doing with that. Okay, what then is the New Apostolic Reformation? That's when it became clear to me, this is C. Peter Wagner speaking. Now, C. Peter Wagner was a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, and he had joined up with John Wimber, who had a Signs and Wonders course. And C. Peter Wagner was sick, and Wimber laid hands on him and was healed. That was a defining moment for C. Peter Wagner in terms of, he was a professor of missions. So Wagner was a real, serious church authority in different circles. Let's put it that way. So he comes to this realization that the New Apostolic Reformation is needed. We then did the most important characteristic. We found these new churches was that they had a new authority structure which was different from traditional Christianity. That played itself off on the local level, with pastors being the leader of the church instead of the employee. On a trans-local level, with authority of the apostle over a number of churches. What's very interesting here is the authority structure. If you notice that little pyramid I had up there earlier, a lot of what you see in these movements, especially the apostles and apostolic companies and those kinds of things that you hear, is the pyramid nature of its authority system. It goes in and the shepherding movement that came out in the 80s. And I had to deal with that. I mean, I worked with college students a lot. And one of the major groups of this movement was very active at that time was Maranatha Campus Ministry with Bob and Rose Weiner. Bob claimed to be an apostle, and Joe Smith was his prophet. Wasn't connected with the Mormons, by the way. It's a different one. So, Wagner was struck, in particular, that in Latin America, his major field for mission studies, large churches were operating in urban areas under the leadership of people who had no contact with Western missionary or missions-initiated institution. Yet, says Wagner, they had churches of several thousand people and were leading them with a degree of authority that most of us were not used to. That's a very interesting statement. Why is that? Now, this is Paul Cain, who was considered a prophet within the Kansas City prophets, apostles, but he taught the Latter-Rain Man-Child Company. Now that was something I was getting as I was leaving the law. I was just starting to learn about that. So, this corporate Christ has very serious theological implications if you take the message seriously. And that's important, the message. When you think of David Koresh, and what happened in Waco, and why those people followed him the way they did, they considered him the messenger. He had the message. That's the way they would turn. If you listen to the group language, that's what they put on it. So if you get the message, that means something. So the authority part of this is a big deal in terms of the corporate Christ, the man-child company, the authority that goes with that, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of the gospel, It's the nature of how the kingdom is being defined. And that has theocratic implications. Just as much as some people are concerned about Islam and their caliphates, there's this version of things that can get really heavy duty, and I'm going to try to cover some of why that's an issue. Every time, I'm continuing with Wagner here, every time Jesus began building his church a new way throughout history, he provides new wineskins. The growth of the church through the ages, and part of the story, is new wineskins. Now notice what the new wineskin is. If you're familiar with anything in the New Testament about this, what happens if you try to put new wine into old wineskins? It bursts. It can't hold it. The leather just cracks. Well, the new wineskin's needed. So when you're talking new wineskins, what is this all about? So The denominational church structure is part of the old wineskin system. Now, when I was in Babylon, was a big deal, you know, and down by the rivers of Babylon, we were crying for Zion. You got to get out of Babylon. I was in the process of getting involved in getting into one of the farm-type communities. We were really willing to sacrifice everything to build this thing, living together in community. So I have a personal understanding of some of the farm relationships that I hear about with the move and what people have gone through. I mean, I know people who live through these things, so I can appreciate your experience with that. The New Apostolic Reformation is an extraordinary work of God at the close of the 20th century, to a significant extent changing the shape of Protestant Christianity around the world, Wagner explains. For almost 500 years, Christian churches have largely functioned within traditional denominational structures of one kind or another, particularly in the 1990s, having roots that go as far back and new forms and operational procedures that operate in areas such as local church government, interchurch relationship, finances, evangelism, missions, prayer, leadership, selection, training, the role of supernatural power, worship, and other important aspects of church life. Now, some of these changes are being seen within denominations, but for the most part, they are taking part from a loosely structured apostolic network. So it's the nature of how the apostles and prophets network with each other. Now, when I was in Southern California, at the latter end of my stay in the law, I remember the apostolic company, and I met the apostolic company there. When I lived in the Philadelphia area, we didn't have an apostolic company. That came later for me, when I finally was at their school, the prophets in California. So Wagner believes that these new truths are being revealed. Remember that thing I showed you with Joseph Smith in his Book of Mormon? You get other ones that, when we had personal directed prophecies, we had to keep books of these things. People kept recordings of their living words that they would receive through directed prophecy, through the laying on of hands. So the new truths really matter. So Wagner says that he is going to build his church. He's following up on what Jesus claimed, that Jesus would build his church. So that there's a new paradigm of churches. That's the big shift. And so what it means is, what is the size and influence of this? Now, one of the things that happens when you have founders that die, things can change. But usually, founders are very careful on who succeeds them. If you have a sudden death, one of the historic patterns that you see is the family will make certain claims. You got this with Joseph Smith. You have the reorganized church, you have the Church of Temple Lot, you have these different fundamentalist groups that we hear a lot about on the news these days. With minors, women getting pregnant, girls getting pregnant, and having babies. And this is all done through religious rituals that they are associated with. And also marriages, the older Mormon men deliberately marrying the younger women. And then you have what's called the lost boys phenomenon, where the younger guys get kicked out. And why are they getting kicked out? Well, the older guys want the younger girls. And these young guys who really end up being out in the street with nothing. What's so important about that is when a group decides to expel you, what do you have? Especially when you put all your eggs in their basket. I was on the way to doing that. I would have been in debt for a good portion of my life if I had gone into this farm-related type project that the Walk was doing, that I would have been a part of myself. So I was spared that because when I left, because of Winnie's death. I learned some painful things through that, but I also came to appreciate what other people go through when they go through these personal struggles of the group. The love is conditional. At the beginning, you get this acceptance, and you think the love is unconditional. It's only when you get deeper into it, and if you don't go along with the group terms and concepts, you start to have issues start coming up. And when you're out, you're out. The support that you had is just not there. Relationships of a lifetime are seriously impacted, especially if you're born into one of these. Now, I'm a first generation, but I have observed second generations of various kinds of group, and my heart goes out to them, you know, because their nurturing parents have been true believers in the totalism of what the group is about. And there's all kinds of groups that have very different beliefs, but the totalism is very similar. The stories are very similar, even though the doctrines are very diverse. It's amazing when you see that. But when you're dealing with the power and authority structure, when you're dealing with authority issues versus submission issues, and part of the reason I'm getting into the New Apostolic Reformation is we're talking about something that's networking on a worldwide scale, and it's meant to go in big places. It's not, you're not talking about just communes in remote areas that want to be away from Babylon, for example. They want to be away from the world. They want to be away from Egypt. You know, they want to be away from that kind of thing. This is meant to permeate and be a second Reformation on a scale greater than what took place with Martin Luther and John Calvin and what impacted Western civilization. To me, this is serious stuff, yes.
Dave, as I'm listening to you talk right now, a question's occurring in my mind, and that is, can you tell us anything at all about the New Dominion stuff that's going on at the Air Force Academy, the sort of penetration of this kind of theology at the Air Force Academy?
I know of groups that they want to go after social institutions. The military is a big one. They try to be influential where they can. It is, in fact, I was going to mention this, and I want to show you. This is not the Air Force, but I worked with the United States Navy years ago. They literally went to the extent of putting a group off limits to all military personnel. The group tried to sue them based on First Amendment grounds, you know, and the military won their case. Even the Secretary of the Navy Department of Defense was L.R. Davis. He had a base right outside of the Naval Training Station in Waukegan, Illinois. And the military, the command staff was concerned about divided loyalties. Well, the former members that I worked with, they used in testimony and put this group off limits. They also sued the newspaper that wrote the stories about them. So they didn't win, which we're very, very thankful for that. But I wanted to show you this in terms of the passing of the mantle. Do we have anybody that's familiar with the TBN network? Some of you are aware of it.
And now, behind the scenes international report with TBN founder and president Paul Crouch. Join us for Paul's Around the World daily report to you, our partners.
And I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My son, we have much to bless the Lord for today, do we not?
Well, I think we do. We have guests in studio with us.
Yes.
One from very far away, Samuel Smadja, all the way from Jerusalem, Israel. And Pastor, Chicago,